Thank you everyone for coming. Welcome. This is our last talk in our fall colloquium series. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Broseder, who is a specialist of the pre- and early history of the Eurasian steppes at the University of Bonn, with particular interest in the archaeology of the Xiongnu Empire and long-distance exchange across the Eurasian world region. She's conducted extensive fieldwork in Inner Asia and Mongolia, and is engaged in a number of very interesting projects, including, and I'll just give you the titles, bioarchaeological studies on the Bronze Age and Iron Age cemetery of Maikan Tolgoi in the Upper Orkhon Valley, central Mongolia. This project has been funded by the German Research Foundation, and the results of which have been published in a number of multi-authored articles, including most recently bioarchaeology of Bronze and Iron Age skeletal finds from a microregion in central Mongolia. And this was Dr. Broseder and Jan Beman and Jörul Erdene. And this was published in Anthropologischer Anzeiger in 2019. A second project is titled Cultural Exchange from the Late Bronze, Early Iron Age to the Late Iron Age, Xiongnu period in the Upper Orkhon Valley, central Mongolia. This was started in 2012 and financed by the Gerda Henkel Foundation. Currently, she also serves as an associate member of BASAR, Beyond the Silk Road Work Group. This is I just took the blurb from the website. This is a multi-year project, I think a 5-year project, generously funded by the European Research Council, which seeks to provide a global perspective on economic development and inter-imperial exchange in the Afro-Eurasian world region. It investigates the nature of economic development in several large empires in this region and explores the condition under which considerable quantities of goods were moved across and between these spaces. Dr. Broseder is no stranger to the United States. She was at Princeton, and most recently, in 2018 and 19, she was a research fellow at the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World, also known as ISOC, at NYU. Today, Dr. Broseder will give a talk in this annual program of the Tang Center, which focuses on the steppe regions of Eurasia. Her talk is titled First Steps, the Silk Road from a Steppe Perspective. So please help me welcome Dr. Ursula Broseder.
Thank you very much, Sanjot Mehendaleev and Frank Billiet, for inviting me here to speak in the series of the Tang Center for Silk Road Studies. I'm honored to speak here, and it is my first time to be in Berkeley. And as you know, concerning the weather, actually in Mongolia, it's a sign of good luck and great prosperity. So I think the weather is probably in order. Today, I want to take you deep into the Eurasian steppes, all the way into Mongolia, and take you back in time to explore some issues connected with horse riding, and to show you that the archaeology of Mongolia, which tends to be overlooked, plays an important role in the study of world history and the history of the Silk Road. So bear with me, and I hope you enjoy the ride through the steppes and through time. But first, let us start in the Black Sea area, where we find a handful of elite graves of the 1st century CE, which are richly furnished with gold and everything else, but also with Chinese goods that are buried with them, with the deceased. Here in this case, it's the 10th burial of Kobyakovo, which is located in the Lower Don area, and you find with it a complete Chinese mirror. Or we turn to Crimea, where we find in a cemetery of Ust-Alma in Catacomb 220, with Hellenistic golden reefs, we find a set of lacquer boxes which are already, when they were produced in China, highly expensive. So we have a handful of these elite graves where we have these Chinese goods, and when it comes to explaining how do the goods end up all the way across thousands of kilometers further to the west from their point of origin, usually people say, oh, it's the Silk Road. So I just briefly want to not delve into that topic of the perceptions of the Silk Roads, which are often, of course, perceived as, we have images of caravans that move through deserts and move goods as a mercantile network. And I want to pick up the thread that Michael Frascetti a couple of weeks ago mentioned in his recent talk, that the Silk Roads is, of course, a topic full of tropes. When thinking of the Silk Roads, we envision it as a city network, hubs that are connected by highways, bustling with trade and prosperity. And when it's mapped out, you find something which looks like this, an example of the most recent book edited by Susan Whitfield on the Silk Roads. So today I want to direct your attention to an area that is, kind of left out of the picture. And I want to show you that it does play a role, and it is very informative if we put our concentration to integrate this area into a narrative. So, it depends. Whenever you see such a map, Inner Asia or Mongolia specifically, they drop out of the picture. Here you see, for example, that while you see many of the cities connected here, this is a group of burials. And so since we don't have cities in that time period, which is mapped out here, which is the Xiongnu period, 200 BC to the 1st century CE, so there's a couple of burial sites mentioned, and they are somewhat unorganically connected to the rest of this network with straight lines going in and out, and we don't know what this is supposed to mean. But even if you turn to other road maps, you find always the same picture, a dense web of roads, and then here in this case, it's the medieval case of Karakorum, which is then connected to China and to the rest, and So what happens is that at some point, this area does also play a role, and then just some lines are drawn that, extend that Silk Road web specifically. Of course, there is a reason because the steppe belt is not integrated, as cities are missing in the steppes for many periods of time. And Michael Frascetti has shown earlier a deep history of the connectivity across large areas in Eurasia based on pastoralists' network, fostered by seasonal migrations and population movements that show the dispersal of goods, innovations, and people, which in some instances can take a very long time period in order to be moved across larger parts of Eurasia. In my talk, I will focus on two topics that highlight the importance of the region that I mentioned previously. And it's not only during the time of Genghis Khan that this area played a role in the world history, but also in prehistory and the early historical periods, this region has an impact on other parts in Eurasia and in China. When we map out the dispersal of Chinese goods in the time period of the late 1st century BCE and the 1st century CE, we see a picture that is like this, number of dots that are located in the Eurasian steppe. And this dispersal is kind of complementary to the road network that we saw in the previous, I indicated it with a couple of lines, and it overlaps in Central Asia. But actually what we see here is to the north of the routes that we have mapped out. So it's a rather complementary picture that we see. We see also that we have a rather large cluster of goods in South Siberia and Mongolia, and it's worth to take a closer look at this. Now, I want to focus on the 1st century CE, as we witness two things in this time period. First of all, we see an increase in Chinese goods spreading throughout Eurasia, and this is actually the first time that we see it in such a vast manner. And we see also an increase in the speed of the dispersal. In the following, I will show you the socio-political context behind this picture and the social dynamics involved. But before we do that, I would like to take you a little bit back in time to take a look at in order to get a better picture of the political and social dynamics involved. I would like to take a look at mobility that in the Eurasian steppes is closely connected with the horse and its use for riding. And I want to take a look at the social group of the horse riders. Now, how can we, as archaeologists, identify horse riding? We have several avenues and several different sources that we can use. Most often, archaeologists talk about horse riding when we have the evidence of horse gear in the actual burial. So then it's rather easy. The second thing what we can use is we can work with the horse bones and envision some sorts of bridling, and that gives us an information whether the horse was used for transport and riding. And the third source we have is when we have depictions in art of horse riders. We can also employ the history of the horse through the lens of genetics, as of course we need to have tamed and domesticated horses before we can ride them. Now, I just want to point out this study by Gaunitz et al. From 2018, which has this interesting piece of information that the earliest domesticated horse we find in northern Kazakhstan in a site that is called Botai, and that is, dates around 3500 BC. So in the 4th millennium BC, we have evidence in this site that we have domesticated horses. And the interesting thing about this study, which has also sampled other horses from other parts of Eurasia, also from Mongolia, but also northern China and from Europe, which date to a somewhat later time period. It seems that these later horses throughout Eurasia are not connected with the Botai horses. In this graphics, you can see that the Botai horses are this rather green blob of cluster of points. And the modern present-day Przewalski horse that you find still in Mongolia is a feral form, a descendant of these Botai horses. But all the other more modern or otherwise throughout, right from the first millennium BC, second millennium CE sampled horses have nothing to do with these Botai horses. So, in conclusion, that has a very big implication. It means that the authors suggest that in the 3rd millennium, either a large integration or inbreeding of other horses has taken place that changes completely the genetic pool, or we have a different and another center, independent center of horse domestication. So let's keep that in mind when we come to Mongolia. When we dive into the history in Mongolia and the archaeology, we end up in the Bronze Age because we have burial mounds that are called hiriksurs. They date between 1300 and 900 BC. Those are burial mounds that are fenced in by a stone, by a row of stones, and they do have additional features around them. In these satellite features, of which we have two types, we have a ring type, we find calcined burnt bones of sheep or goat sacrifice, and in the burial mounds, we find the remains of horse heads. And these can be analyzed, but these hiriksurs are connected with a second type of monument, which are beautiful stone stelae that are carved and ornamented with these deers, which is why they are called deer stones. And they represent warriors. Sometimes you see a face on the top. You always find a belt. And on the belt, you see hanging several tools and weapons. And we see here a shield, an arrow, a bow and arrow, and here is a necklace ornament that we find. So we see these stelae as representation of warriors. Surrounding these deer stones, we often find small stone mounds, and in these stone mounds, we find again deposited horse heads. So it's the same ritual practice that we can one time have associated with these hiriksur burial mounds, and the second time associated with these stelae. Now, when the colleague William Taylor, a archaeologist, archaeologist and a specialist of ancient horse skeletal remains, investigated these horse heads, he found that they have some indentations in the skull, and he interprets this, and this sounds very convincing, that these horses were ridden or at least used for pulling a vehicle, but he, in a more recent article, he argued because of the asymmetries that he can observe and because of ethnographic comparison, it's very likely that these horses were ridden. Since they appear in the, as I showed you, with the deer stones and the Chirixus, he dates the beginning of horse riding to 1200 BC onwards, or the more intensified use of horse riding to 1200 BC onwards. And here comes into play our Barkhor project, and I just want to briefly mention a few aspects. So our project Barkhor is the acronym for Bioarchaeological Research in Cemeteries of the Upper Ochon Valley, and we work in the central Mongolia in the Upper Ochon Valley, 30 kilometers south of Kharkhorin, Karakorum, which is the capital of Genghis Khan. Now, in this small region, we mapped out all the superficially visible burial structures that we could identify, and this is a mountain ridge, Maichan Tolgoi, on which its southwestern slope, a cemetery of about 104 structures has been mapped, and we investigated this cemetery because it's an ideal situation for an in-depth study in order to understand the dynamics of social changes throughout time in this cemetery. And we conducted 4 years of our research in this cemetery. The great advantage of this cemetery is also here you see the structures located along the ridge, is that you see, like, even if you don't know anything about these burial structures, that they have all sorts of different forms. We have a very high diversity, and that allows us to work with them and get a good knowledge about the structure of the site. We have excavated 27 structures. We have around 14 radiocarbon dates, and therefore we have a very good knowledge about we can very well reconstruct the use of the cemetery. And one of the central questions is, when does the cemetery begin? When do such cemeteries begin, or ritual landscapes? When do they start? And when do we have horse riders? And to make it short, the answer is around 1500 the cemetery begins, and around 1500 we do have the horse riders. And both goes together. So in the phase one, which we can date to the 1500 to 1300 BC, we have large burials that are of the Saksai type, but that doesn't have to concern you. They are built, they are square or round, and their corners are usually fortified with either stele or at least larger stones propped against each other. And in the center, when you excavate it, you find a central structure that covers a burial pit for one single individual. And all the large structures that we have excavated are made for male individuals, which can either be adolescents or adult or mature. And the interesting thing about this specific individual is that it has a rider's facet. That is an anthropological feature of the femur, and once you grow up during the adolescent age or time period and you sit on the horse for a long time, you may develop such an anatomical anomaly. It doesn't have to be in every case, but when you can see such a rider's facet, it means that habitual riding was there. This individual was habitually riding. Burial of a different type, those are so-called figure-shaped burials, where we also have a male individual with a rider's facet, and also this burial belongs to the first phase, which is why we're rather confident to say that around the mid of the second millennium BC, archaeologically, we have in central Mongolia, we can see habitual riding is established. We do have, however, also another avenue, rock art, in order to see what rock art can tell us about horse riding. And for that, we with the petroglyphs, we reach a completely new depth, possibly even the 3rd millennium BCE. And this type, the specialist Esther Jacobsen-Töpfer from Oregon has spent almost all her life identifying and recording and sorting and interpreting the rock art of the Altai region, which is in northwest Mongolia. And this type of depiction of horses belongs to a very old type of depicting animals. And we see this old type, some small figure sitting on top. So it can be disputed whether that actually already shows riding, but it is theoretically possible, and we don't have to rule out. And you remember that when I told you that we currently don't know where this second center of horse domestication is, that I would suggest that Mongolia or Inner Asia can be such an area or is closely connected to such an area. Now, in the Middle Bronze Age, or let's say maybe I would suggest in the first half of the 2nd millennium BCE, we see images like this one, where we have humans depicted with, something what is called a mushroom-headed cap. It's a furry cap. They are depicted with large bows or spears, and they are associated with two-wheeled vehicles, either with spoked wheels or with disc wheels. They are shown hunting animals, which is the means of locomotion they use the horses for. And so that is the first half of the 2nd millennium. We don't see these mushroom-headed people riding on horses. However, when we reach the late Bronze Age, which I would now connect with the mid-2nd millennium BC onwards, we see a totally different type of people. They wear belted tunics, and they have pants, and they have clubs, and they don't have these mushroom-headed caps anymore, and you see them on horses riding, and here you see a fully equipped hunter pursuing a horse from horseback. So this is about abbreviated what we think currently, or what I think currently, about the history of the horse and its use in Inner Asia. Now, you may ask why this is all important to know, and how does it relate to studies of the Silk Road and trans-Eurasian exchanges. For starters, of course, mastering the horse gives you a new range of mobility in a shorter period of time. It's not so much the range of mobility that changes, but the speed to cover a certain distance. And in this step, it is the ideal animal to employ for mobility. And secondly, I showed you the emergence of a social group that we can now link with covering distances, which is the mounted warrior, which I showed you with the stele of the deer stones. And for that, I want to draw your attention now to the late 1st millennium BCE, when a group called Xiongnu in the Chinese sources established an empire in the steppes of present-day northern China and Mongolia. And the first social group that shows us the long-distance connectivity is the group of the male warriors. Now, to give you a very, very brief history, of course, you can read a couple of books about this empire from a historical perspective. So my bullet points are really just a mere sketchy outline of what's going on. According to the legend has it that Mu Dun trained a personal army and subsequently conquered neighboring people. Then in 209 BCE, those who draw the bow may be claimed as all our Xiongnu are one, which is reported from Sima Qian in the Chinese sources. Now, the military strengths, raids into northern China were conducted, and the Han sought an appeasement through a marriage alliance politics, marriage alliance treaty, which is called Heqin, and that meant that princesses were married to the Xiongnu court, and with the princesses, of course, came dowries and tribute payments in order to appease these northern neighbors who conducted the raids, and the Chinese couldn't figure out how to appease them. And that was one way to try that. By the end of the 2nd century BCE, the He Qin failed, and war was waged against the Xiongnu to cut off the right arm of the Xiongnu, and that eventually turned out to be successful. As in 50 BCE, we know that a huge crisis came about, and a civil war raged among the Xiongnu, and a little bit later, we know from the sources that the Xiongnu expressed their desire to turn to the very profitable He Qin Treaty. By the end of the 1st century CE, then, the Xiongnu were defeated by a coalition of Xianbei, another group of pastoral people in the steppes, in concert with the Chinese, who invaded Xiongnu lands and killed the ruler. So from 209 to around 209 BC to 100 CE, we know that the Xiongnu Empire was dominating the region. Archaeologically, we see a reflection of this empire in an archaeological culture that starts around the 2nd century, the early 2nd century BC, with the emergence of a new set of shared burial practices and a rather homogeneous material culture. And it spreads, its center is in northern Mongolia, with a couple of burial sites in northern China. Now, this empire, we can now ask, so let's take a look, because we're interested in how the Chinese goods end up eventually in the Black Sea area. Let's take a look now what are the contexts of the flow of the Han goods to the Xiongnu, and we see that there are different avenues. At one, we know that we have from the written records, we know that there is gifting from the imperial court. So here I highlight a few instances that the Emperor Cao thus sent Liu Qing to offer a princess of the imperial house as the Shanyu, who is the local ruler, and to annually offer the Xiongnu wadding, silk fabrics, wine, grain, and other foodstuffs, each in fixed quantities, and to conclude a marriage alliance as brothers. In these documents that mention this gifting, there is also an emphasis on valuable goods, as you see embroidered robes mentioned, etc., etc. But we have also in the written records mentioning of border trade and the importance that border trade was important for the Xiongnu. So in one passage it reads that from this onwards the filial emperor Qing again made a marital alliance with the Xiongnu. I can't read this. To reopen the markets on the border passes, provided for the Xiongnu with presents, and sent them a princess, like in the times of the former agreements. And the other mention and the other context that we have, how the Xiongnu got Chinese goods or raids. So, with the regards, however, of the social context, the written and material sources refer to the same group, the highest echelon of Xiongnu society in the context of political gifting or tribute payment, as a reason for the transfer of Chinese goods. And although we know about the importance of frontier trade from the side of the Xiongnu, which is of course less mentioned in the court documents, it is especially the payments to the Chanyu court that is mentioned. Moreover, since the Xiongnu show repeatedly interest in returning to a He Qin treaty, securing the annual influx of Chinese goods, it may be taken as an indicator of a prestige goods economy in the Xiongnu realm from a historical perspective. So the written and the material sources refer to the same social group, the highest echelon of Xiongnu society. Now, when we take a look at received goods and stimuli from China, and compare it from an earlier phase, which is from the 2nd century BC to the early 1st century BC, and a later phase, you see that in the later phase we had a much more diverse amount of goods. So in the beginning it was more silk, mirrors, lacquer objects, and cowrie shells. in the text are additionally mentioned, which we of course don't see, princesses and consumables. And in the later phase, additionally to what has been said before, we also have metal vessels and architectural elements, coins, cowrie beads, and chariots. When we look at the social context, where we find Han goods in Xiongnu burials, we find them on the one hand in elite burial tombs, even if you don't have to know the specifics of these elite tombs. But these are huge terrace tombs which can be extremely large and are about 20 meters deep, interred into the ground. And in them you find silk kaftans, you find prestigious horse gear, you find textiles from Central Asia, as well as, in this case, a lacquered cup with an inscription that makes it specifically clear that it has been produced at the imperial court. We do also find, however, these lacquered cups in much more simpler graves. The same is, by the way, true for Han mirrors. On the one hand, we find them in these elite, very richly furnished, very big, large, elite tombs, and on the other hand, in simpler tombs. Now, one underlying system and one part of the economy is mostly probably a prestige goods economy that shows the internal dispersals of prestige goods that have been acquired by high status person and has been then distributed down to lower ranks. Now, although we don't have yet unraveled the mercantile economic sector, and we know that goods were also exchanged through border markets, this does not apply for these very high prestigious goods. Okay, so now this is an internal system, and this explains how partly a larger amount of Chinese goods has been distributed down to the lowest ranks, because all the burials that we excavate the Xiongnu, we find remains of silk, we find remains of small pieces of lacquer fragments, and that is a huge amount that cannot otherwise be accounted for. Now, when it comes to, let's take a look now at the dispersal of goods and the trans-Eurasian exchanges. When it comes to the 2nd and 1st century BCE, we see two larger interaction spheres in the Eurasian steppe. One is this eastern interaction sphere that is probably reflecting the Xiongnu Empire, and the second one is a western interaction sphere. These interaction spheres have a shared set of belt plaques, and belt plaques are used in this context in the steppes as a prestigious sign of status and rank, probably. And in the West, we have different ornaments and a slightly different type of belt plaques than in the eastern part, where we have a variety of animal-style ornaments. But at the same time, we do have also this type of belt plaque with this lozenge pattern, and we find it in Mongolia, we find it in Central Asia, and we find it in the Black Sea area or the Western steppes. And if we look at the social context, we see that these kind of belts show up in warrior graves. We see here an example of a burial from the Xiongnu in the Transbaikal Mongolian region. We have here a burial of a warrior interred in Uzbekistan, and here on the same idea of a belt plaque of a warrior in the Lower Don area. However, these people, of course, are not the same people. They all have very different practices, how the burials were constructed and with what kind of accoutrements they were buried. They have the local pottery, they have a very different burial types. Here you see a shaft burial. Here this is a catacomb burial where you enter here the shaft and then the deceased is laid down, and here is a niche burial. So clearly these are very distinct archaeological sets, but what they share is a common language of these prestigious elements. If we look at the 2nd century and early 1st century BCE, at the Chinese mirrors. We see them also concentrated in Mongolia and southern Siberia, the area exactly the same where we have this eastern interaction sphere, the area where we do have the Xiongnu Empire. Now, when we turn to the 1st century BCE, late 1st century BCE, and the 1st century CE, we see a completely different picture of Chinese mirrors. We have a huge concentration in Mongolia, we have a concentration in Central Asia, and we have one in the Black Sea area. The same accounts, by the way, for lacquer goods at the same time period. When we look at, we have a huge concentration in Mongolia, we have somewhat trickling into Western Eurasia, we have some in Central Asia, and we have very few in the Western area. When we look at the dating of where the Han artifacts arrive, go across this magical, very roughly sketchy border, they only show up here in the 1st century CE. So we have a deep history of Chinese objects circulating in Inner Asia, but only in the 1st century CE we have them being distributed to the Western regions. Now, we do not only have Chinese goods that are spread across the Eurasian steppes, but we have also examples of what I call Inner Asian fashioning. And I want to just show 2 examples here. This is a certain type of horse gear. Those are cheek pieces or psalia with disc-shaped ends. They come in all sorts, but it's the same idea. They all have this disc-shaped end at the end. This one has a very beautiful stone inlay, while this one has only gold foil on top of it. And you see, again, Mongolia with the Xiongnu Empire emerging, and you see very few in Central Asia, but that has the reason that just horse gear is not deposited in the burials. However, we have one time a depiction of a horse head, and you see the very same type of horse cheek pieces with disc-shaped ends. And we see again the Black Sea area highlighted, and the same accounts for a certain type of strap end that you can find across Eurasia. Of course, exchanges do not also go one way. There is also the return route. We do have Western objects in Xiongnu period burials. Those are, for example, certain glass beads that come from the West, Egyptian faience pendants, probably maybe also amber, although the testing still needs to be done to see whether that is really the type of Baltic amber. There is also amber in China, but it doesn't seem to fit. However, it theoretically can be tested, just hasn't been done yet. I would suspect that some of the amber definitely is from the West. And here you see a Roman glass bowl. And when it was excavated by a Mongolian colleague, all my colleagues at Bonn who study the Roman Empire, they're like, what? Why do we find a complete glass bowl and not just only a small fragment, which is the usual of these very delicate glass bowls? And we do have Central Asian textiles. In the 1st century CE, we see 2 other things happening. First, we find across all Eurasia that the emergence of richly furnished graves. It seems as if through the connectivity that I shows, there is an elite showing off in the burial rituals as we have ostentatious graves as well in the Black Sea area. We have it in the Xiongnu realm, we have it in Central Asia. And the second thing that connects this phenomenon is that they share also to a certain degree a specific style of goods, which you can, with this gold turquoise style, maybe immediately get. And there are elements that connect these graves together. You have the Tangga sign among the Xiongnu, and they show up with the Sarmatians in the Black Sea area as well. So this is a phenomenon that kind of highlights a koine and the emergence of a specific common language of this elite koine. When you map that out, again, you see the same areas highlighted that we had seen previously. What I want to show you right now is this is a just a diagram in order to, a schema to better understand. In the beginning, in the 2nd century, when we had these warriors with the belts that connected, with the same belts types that we can find across Eurasia, it was as if we have a warrior elite that has a common language of sharing prestigious goods. And when it comes to the 1st century CE, we have the display in the burials just shows these very high status persons, shows these ostentatious burials which are furnished to the maximum with gold. And we have the spread of status symbols, fashioning, military technology, which seems to go across these high status elites. When we map that into into a schema, how can we understand this in terms of regional dispersal? We can see in blue here that I suggest we have a working step network that accounts for what we see archaeologically happening and what connects the East with the West and the West with the East and both areas with Central Asia. And you see that each of these regions exchanges a variety of either inner Asian fashioning, inner Asian goods, or Chinese goods. And then Han China plays a very limited role. I mean, it does take impulses from the steppes and integrates it into their material culture and prestige language. But this is a step network that functions completely independent from anything that goes on in China. This existing step network, which has a much deeper chronology in time, is also responsible for distributing Han Chinese goods. Because vice versa, you cannot explain through Han Chinese channels or caravans the dispersal of this inner Asian fashioning and what's going on in the inner Asian steppes. Vice versa, it makes much more sense. And we know that a rather intensive flow of Han Chinese goods comes into the Xiongnu realm through the text, through the archaeology, and I think it's just then hooked into this network. And that's why I think that the Xiongnu plays such an important role in this, in the distribution of Han Chinese objects. Now, this step, of course, you have to keep in mind that these regions are all distinct regions, distinct archaeological cultures. And I think the explanation why in the 1st century CE suddenly it becomes such a quick dispersal across such a vast area of time is that the distinct regions are just connected with a few connections that needed to be made, while every other region had been in contact before. So within Central Asia, of course, there had been a longer standard. It's an interaction sphere that has a long, deep history. And the same in Inner Asia, the same in the Western steppes. But once these are all connected, the goods are just simply moved per express through across the steppes. This network, however, cannot be separated from what we think is the Silk Road, that we know from the written records, where trade plays a crucial role. Rather, I see it as an additional source for the study of the connectivity and exchanges across Eurasia. And I think that both go together hand in hand, just our source material is so uneven that we have trouble bringing them on par with each other. Now, what happens in the aftermath? I told you that in the 1st century CE, at the end of the 1st century CE, that the Xiongnu Empire declined, it was defeated. And when we look at the distribution of Chinese goods in the 2nd and 3rd century CE, you see that this area, which has been the most prominent area before, doesn't play a role anymore. But we see that other goods distributed through Central Asia show up also in the Black Sea area. And those are mirrors that belong to a little bit later period in the scabbard slides and Nefert sword guards, which come out of China. So In the aftermath, we see Mongolia drop out of the picture, but the transmission of goods continue, and the established networks are now continuing to function. And I thank you for your attention.